They said the mountain man had not smiled in 7 years. So when Clara Bell rode into the wilderness and wagered that she could make him smile before winter came, everyone in the little settlement laughed. But she did not know that behind his silence was a grief so terrible that one innocent smile could reopen the deepest wound he had spent years trying to bury. And before this story ends, Clara will discover why the loneliest man in the mountains stopped smiling, and why the first smile he gives her may cost him everything. If you enjoy emotional mountain stories like this, take a moment to like the video, leave a comment telling us what you think Clara should do, and subscribe to the Mountain Tribe for more stories from the wilderness. In the autumn of 1878, far beyond the nearest railway and several days from the nearest proper town, there was a settlement called Black Pine. It was hardly a town at all. A dozen rough wooden buildings stood scattered along a narrow valley, surrounded by mountains so steep that in winter, the sunlight disappeared from the valley floor before noon. There was a general store, a blacksmith's shed, a small church, a boarding house, and perhaps 20 families living in cabins along the creek. Beyond Black Pine, there was almost nothing. No telegraph line, no train station, no paved road, only a narrow wagon trail that climbed into the mountains, before disappearing beneath pine trees and rock. The people of Black Pine knew how to live without depending on the outside world. They hunted elk and deer, they trapped beaver and fox, they cut timber, they raised chickens, grew what crops the short summer allowed, and preserved enough food to survive the brutal winters. But there was one man in those mountains whom almost everyone knew, even though hardly anyone knew him. His name was Silas Boone. Silas lived alone, nearly 15 miles beyond Black Pine, in a weather-beaten cabin beside a frozen-looking creek that remained cold even during the height of summer. He was 36 years old, broad-shouldered, strong from years of chopping wood and hauling game, and known throughout the valley as a man who could survive almost anything. A broken rifle, Silas could repair it. A wounded horse, he knew how to treat it. A blizzard, he had survived worse. A starving winter, he had endured several. But there was one thing people in Black Pine said Silas could no longer do: smile. Not once. Not even when something was genuinely funny. Not when a child accidentally dropped a pie in the mud. Not when a drunk hunter fell backward into a horse trough. Not even when the town's preacher once confused 2 verses during Sunday service and accidentally told the entire congregation that the Lord had commanded them to feed the chickens and forgive their enemies. Silas had simply stared ahead. That story became one of the few things people in Black Pine could laugh about. Some believed he had simply been born without humor. Others said he was bitter. A few claimed he had spent too many years alone in the mountains and had forgotten how ordinary people behaved. But the older residents knew there was more to it. They remembered Silas before the silence. They remembered a younger man who had once laughed loud enough to be heard from the far end of the valley. They remembered him riding into Black Pine with his younger brother, Caleb, who was always joking and always getting into trouble. They remembered the 2 brothers building their cabin together. They remembered Silas courting a young woman named Anna. And then, one winter, everything changed. No one in Black Pine liked talking about that winter. So when Clara Bell arrived in town during the first week of October, she knew only the legend. She was 27 years old, stubborn by nature, quick with words, and far too confident in her ability to understand people. Clara had spent most of her life moving from place to place with her father, who traded tools, cloth, medicines, and other supplies between isolated settlements. She had learned how to ride before she could properly read. She could handle a rifle. She could mend a torn coat. She could bargain with a shopkeeper until he regretted ever opening his mouth. And Clara believed there was almost no person alive whom she could not make laugh, if given enough time. That belief became her downfall. On the evening she arrived in Black Pine, Clara sat inside the general store while rain tapped against the windows. A group of local men were gathered around the stove. Someone mentioned Silas Boone. Clara listened quietly for several minutes, before finally asking, "Is he really as unpleasant as everyone says?" The room became silent. An older trapper named Amos Reed looked at her. "Unpleasant?" He gave a dry laugh. "Silas ain't unpleasant." "Then what is he?" Amos stared into the fire. "Empty." That single word caught Clara's attention. She leaned forward. "Empty? Like a house after the family leaves." Clara frowned. She expected another joke. Instead, Amos told her that Silas had lived alone for nearly 7 years. "He comes into town twice a month," Amos said. "Gets flour, salt, lamp oil, ammunition. Then he leaves." "Does he speak?" "When necessary." "Does he ever laugh?" "No." "Never?" Amos shook his head. Then another man at the stove smiled. "Bet you couldn't make him." Clara looked over. "What?" The man shrugged. "Make Silas Boone smile." A few people laughed. Clara should have ignored them. Instead, she smiled. "How long?" The laughter stopped. She looked around the room. "How long would I have to make him smile?" Amos immediately said, "Don't." Clara laughed. "Why not?" "Because you don't know what you're playing with." But Clara was already enjoying the attention. Someone suggested 1 week. Another said 3 days. A third man offered $5 if she could make the mountain man laugh before the first snow. Clara raised the stakes. $10. The room erupted. $10 was a considerable amount of money in Black Pine. Clara had no intention of actually winning it. She simply wanted to prove that the famous mountain man was not as impossible as everyone claimed. She made one final statement that she would later regret. "I'll have him smiling before the week is over." Amos stared at her. "Miss Bell, don't make promises about things you don't understand." Clara smiled. "I've made a career of it." The next morning, she rode toward Silas Boone's cabin. The journey took nearly 3 hours. The trail climbed steadily through thick pine forest, crossed a narrow wooden bridge, and followed a mountain stream until the trees opened onto a small clearing. There stood Silas's cabin, one room downstairs, a loft above, a woodpile stacked perfectly beside the wall, a small shed, a horse tied beneath a rough shelter. There were no decorations, no flowers, no unnecessary furniture. Everything had a purpose. Clara dismounted and knocked. Nothing happened. She knocked again. Still nothing. Then the door opened. Silas stood there. Clara had heard descriptions of him, but none had prepared her for the reality. He was taller than she expected. His dark hair was slightly longer than most men's, because he had no reason to visit a barber. His beard was trimmed unevenly. His eyes were gray. Not cold exactly, just tired. Deeply tired. Clara smiled. "Boone?" Silas looked at her. "Yes, I'm Clara Bell." "I know." She blinked. "You know me? Your father brought supplies through here last spring." Clara smiled. "Then you remember me." "No." She almost laughed. Instead, she looked past him. "I came to ask you something." "No, I haven't asked yet." Silas's expression didn't change. "You came all this way. Whatever you're asking, the answer is probably no." Clara stared at him. Then she smiled wider. "I was told you were difficult." Silas looked toward the mountains. They were being polite. That was the first thing he said that made Clara want to laugh. But she stopped herself. She had a bet to win. "I heard you don't smile." Silas looked back at her. "I do." "When?" "When people leave me alone." Clara laughed. Silas didn't. She pointed at him. That was almost funny. It wasn't meant to be. "I think you almost smiled." "I didn't." "You're going to." Silas shook his head. "Why?" "Because I'm going to make you." For the first time, something changed in his expression. Not a smile, not even amusement, something closer to curiosity. Why would you want that? Clara hesitated. She could have told him about the bet. Instead, she said, because everyone thinks you can't. Silas's eyes hardened. Everyone is usually wrong. Then he closed the door. Clara stood outside. She stared at the wooden door. Then she laughed. Well, she muttered, this is going to be harder than I thought. She did not know that Silas was standing on the other side of the door. And he was not angry. He was listening. Because for the first time in years, someone had arrived at his cabin without asking him for meat, medicine, money, or help. Someone had come simply because she believed there was still something alive inside him. That frightened him more than any blizzard ever had. Clara returned the next day, then the day after that. She tried everything. She told ridiculous stories. She pretended to be frightened by a harmless squirrel. She brought him an apple pie and deliberately claimed she had baked it herself, even though the crust was so badly burned that Silas stared at it for several seconds before quietly saying, "Did you bake this?" "Of course. You should apologize to the apple." Clara burst out laughing. Silas remained serious. She pointed at him. "That was another one. You made a joke." "No. You absolutely did. I stated a fact." She smiled. "You're getting better." But Silas wasn't. Every time Clara tried to pull him toward laughter, something behind his eyes seemed to retreat. She began noticing things she hadn't noticed on her first visit. The cabin had 2 chairs. Not 1, 2. But one of them was never used. There were 2 wooden cups on a shelf, 2 sets of old hunting knives, 2 blankets folded neatly in a chest. And above the fireplace was a small carved wooden horse. It was old, very old. Clara asked about it once. Silas immediately changed the subject. She noticed something else. Every year, on the same date, Silas rode into the highest part of the mountains alone. He stayed there until sunset. No one knew why. Clara began to suspect that his silence wasn't personality. It was protection. Something had happened to him. Something he had never allowed himself to speak about. Still, she continued the bet. She told herself it was because she wanted the $10. But by the end of the 3rd day, she knew that was no longer true. She wanted to see him smile, not because she wanted to win, because she had begun to believe that the man behind those gray eyes deserved to experience happiness again. On the 4th morning, Clara arrived at the cabin carrying a basket. Silas was chopping wood. She watched him for a moment. Then she said, "I brought breakfast." "No, you haven't even seen it." "I can smell it. It's eggs." Clara frowned. "Why?" "I like my eggs." "How do you know you won't like mine?" Silas stopped chopping. He looked at her. "Because you burned them yesterday." Clara stared at him. "You remember?" "I remember everything." The words were quiet. Too quiet. Clara's smile disappeared. She suddenly understood that his silence was not forgetfulness. Silas remembered too much. Every detail, every face, every voice, every mistake, every loss. She lowered the basket. "I'm sorry." Silas returned to chopping wood. "For what?" "For asking you to forget." He stopped. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Then Silas said, "You don't know what you're asking." Clara looked at him. "No." She took a breath. "But I think I'm beginning to." Silas's axe lowered slowly. He looked toward the mountains, and for the first time, Clara saw something in his face that wasn't anger. It was fear. Not fear of her, fear of remembering. That evening, Clara returned to Black Pine without a smile. The men at the general store immediately asked whether she had won. She said nothing. One of them laughed. "7 years, Miss Bell. Looks like you're losing." Clara looked toward the dark mountains beyond the settlement. "No," she quietly replied. I think I just realized what the bet was really about. And far above Black Pine, inside a lonely cabin surrounded by pine trees, Silas Boone opened an old wooden box. Inside was a faded woman's ribbon, a child's wooden horse, and a small piece of paper bearing 3 names: Anna, Caleb, Eli. Silas stared at those names for a long time. Then he closed the box. Because 7 years earlier, all 3 had been alive, and by the time winter ended, none of them would be. Clara had come to the mountains believing she could teach a silent man how to smile. She had no idea she was about to uncover the reason he had forgotten how to live. Clara Bell had gone into the mountains believing she was playing a harmless game. By the end of the first week, she understood that Silas Boone was not a man who needed to be entertained. He was a man who had built his entire life around avoiding one particular memory. And Clara was getting dangerously close to it. The morning after she discovered the 3 names inside the wooden box, Clara woke before sunrise. She had barely slept. The names would not leave her mind. Anna, Caleb, Eli. She knew Caleb was Silas's younger brother. Everyone in Black Pine knew that much. Anna, she assumed, had been the woman Silas loved. But Eli? That name was different. Clara had never heard anyone mention him. She could have gone to Amos Reed and asked. Instead, she decided not to. If Silas wanted her to know, he would tell her. That was the first decision she made that changed the relationship between them. She stopped trying to force Silas to smile. She stopped telling jokes. She stopped arriving at his cabin with ridiculous schemes. Instead, she simply began helping. The first morning, she brought flour. The second, she brought lamp oil. The third, she helped repair the fence around his horse shelter. Silas noticed. Of course he noticed. But he said nothing. One afternoon while they were splitting firewood, Silas finally asked, "Why are you still coming?" Clara leaned against the axe handle. "Because you haven't smiled yet." "You gave up on that." "I did." "Then why?" She looked toward the trees. "I don't know." Silas studied her. Clara shrugged. "Maybe I like the mountains." "You don't." "How do you know?" "You complain about the cold." "I complain about everything." "That part I noticed." Clara smiled. Silas looked away. For a moment, she thought she had seen the corner of his mouth move. But when she looked again, his expression was empty. She said nothing. The days passed. Autumn began disappearing from the mountains. The leaves turned copper and gold before the first snow arrived. The creek grew colder. The mornings became white with frost. And Clara started learning Silas's routines. He rose before dawn. He checked the traps. He inspected the horses. He cut wood. He cooked enough food for one person. He read almost nothing. He rarely visited Black Pine. He never drank whiskey. And every evening, before sleeping, he checked the front door twice. That last habit bothered Clara. One night, she asked why. Silas didn't answer. She didn't ask again. There was another thing she noticed. Silas never allowed anyone inside the small storage shed behind the cabin, not even Clara. The door was locked. A heavy iron latch held it shut. When she asked about it, Silas simply said, "Old tools." But Clara knew that wasn't true. There were no sounds of tools being used inside. No firewood was stored there. And once, when Silas opened the door for only a few seconds, Clara saw shelves filled with old belongings. Clothing, books, a child's blanket, and something that looked like a woman's wedding dress wrapped carefully in cloth. He immediately shut the door. Neither mentioned it. Then came the snow. It began on a Tuesday evening. Small flakes at first. By midnight, the mountains were covered. By morning, the trail to Black Pine was nearly invisible. Clara was at Silas's cabin when the storm arrived. She had intended to leave before dark, but Silas had warned her not to attempt the journey. "You'll die on the trail." "I'm not helpless." "I didn't say you were. You sounded like you did." I sound like a man who knows the mountain. She crossed her arms. And what happens if I stay? Silas looked at the storm outside. You stay. That was all. So Clara stayed. The first night passed quietly. The second was worse. Wind struck the cabin hard enough to shake the walls. Snow packed against the windows. The horse shelter disappeared beneath drifts. Silas spent hours clearing the doorway. Clara helped. By the third morning, the world outside had vanished into white. They were trapped. For the first time, Clara saw what Silas's life really looked like. There was no town, no easy escape, no friendly neighbor, no doctor, no rescue wagon. Only the cabin, the mountains, and whatever supplies Silas had managed to preserve. Yet he was calm, almost unnaturally calm. Clara watched him inspect the food stores. We have enough for 8 days, he said. And the storm? Could last 5. Could last 10. Don't sound worried. I've lived through worse. She remembered what Amos had said. Empty. Now she wondered whether the word had been wrong. Silas wasn't empty. He was prepared. Prepared because he had already survived the kind of loss that made ordinary dangers seem small. During the fourth night, Clara woke to find Silas standing beside the window. The moon was hidden. The cabin was dark except for dying firelight. She sat up. Silas? He didn't move. Silas? I'm awake. What are you doing? Listening. To what? He looked toward the door. Nothing. She heard it then. A faint sound. 3 knocks. Clara froze. Silas immediately grabbed his rifle. The knocking came again. 3 slow knocks. Clara whispered, "Who's out there?" Silas said nothing. Another 3 knocks. Then silence. Silas approached the door. Clara caught his arm. "Don't." He looked at her. "There shouldn't be anyone here." "Exactly." Silas gently removed her hand. "Stay behind me." He opened the door. Nothing stood outside. Only snow, wind, darkness. Silas stepped into the storm. Clara watched from the doorway. He walked several yards, then stopped. Something was buried beneath the snow. He knelt and began digging. When he returned, he carried a small leather satchel. Where did that come from? Silas didn't answer. He placed the satchel on the table. His hands were trembling. That frightened Clara more than the mysterious knocking. She had never seen him shake. He opened the satchel. Inside was a collection of old papers, letters, a broken pocket watch, and a small photograph. Clara saw 3 people, a younger Silas, a woman, and a boy. She recognized Silas immediately. The woman had to be Anna. The boy had to be Eli. Clara's chest tightened. Who was he? Silas looked at the photograph. My son. The words struck her harder than any confession could have. Clara stared at him. You had a son? Silas nodded. His name was Eli, she whispered. I never knew. Nobody did. Why? Because he died. Silas placed the photograph face down. He was 6. Clara sat quietly. She finally understood why the name had been hidden, but something still didn't make sense. Caleb? Silas looked toward the fire. My brother. And Anna? Silas closed his eyes. My wife. Clara's throat tightened. All 3 names. 1 family. 1 tragedy. 7 years of silence. But there was something else in his expression. Something she couldn't explain. She waited. Eventually Silas spoke. It happened during the first snow. His voice was almost a whisper. They were coming home from Black Pine. He stared into the flames. Caleb was driving the wagon. Anna was beside him. Eli was asleep beneath a blanket. Clara listened without interrupting. The bridge collapsed. Her hand went to her mouth. The river was already rising. Snow had covered the trail. Caleb tried to get them across. Silas stopped. For a long time, he couldn't continue. Then he said, I reached them too late. Clara's eyes filled with tears. All 3? She asked. He nodded. I found Caleb first. Silence. Anna was still alive. Clara looked at him. Silas's face had changed. For the first time, she could see the younger man Amos had described. The man who once laughed. The man who loved his family. The man who had been destroyed. She asked me to save Eli. Silas's voice broke. I couldn't. Clara closed her eyes. I carried her out. His jaw tightened, but the boy was already gone. The cabin became silent. The storm continued outside. Silas stared into the fire. I spent 7 years thinking I should have saved him. Clara whispered, You couldn't have. I was his father. You were one man. I should have been enough. That sentence stayed between them. Clara understood then. Silas wasn't grieving only because he had lost his family. He was grieving because he had turned their deaths into a judgment against himself. He believed survival was something he had failed to deserve. That was why he never laughed, why he kept 2 chairs, why he preserved the child's blanket, why he climbed into the mountains every year, why he lived alone. He wasn't punishing the world, he was punishing himself. Clara moved closer. Silas. He didn't look at her. You don't have to carry this alone. His eyes hardened. Yes, I do. No, you don't understand. Then explain it. He finally looked at her. You wanted to make me smile. Clara froze. He continued. You made a bet. Her face went pale. You knew? I heard you talking to Amos. Clara swallowed. When? The first day. She looked down. I didn't mean for it to become this. I know. Then why didn't you tell me? Because I wanted to know how long you'd stay after you stopped trying to win. Clara looked at him. What? Silas's voice remained quiet. Most people leave when they realize there's nothing to fix. Clara's eyes filled with tears. I don't want to fix you. Silas stared at her. I don't? No. She shook her head. I think you loved them. His expression changed. And I think losing them broke something inside you. She took a breath. But broken isn't the same as dead. Silas looked away. For the first time, tears appeared in his eyes. He wiped them quickly. Clara pretended not to notice. The storm continued for another 2 days. During those 2 days, something changed between them. Not suddenly, not dramatically. There was no kiss, no declaration, no easy promise. Instead, there were small moments. Clara made coffee. Silas stopped refusing it. She burned breakfast again. This time, he ate it. She complained about the cold. He quietly placed another blanket over her shoulders. He told her stories about the mountains. She told him stories about her childhood. They began laughing at things that weren't funny. Sometimes Clara caught Silas watching her. Sometimes he caught her watching him. Neither spoke about it. Then on the 7th morning, the storm finally broke. Sunlight entered the cabin. The mountains glittered beneath fresh snow. Clara stepped outside. She looked toward the valley. Beautiful. Silas stood beside her. Yes. She smiled. You're going to smile one day. Silas looked at her. I already did. Clara turned. When? He looked toward the cabin. The morning you burned the eggs. She laughed. You did not smile. I did inside. Clara shook her head. That doesn't count. It does to me. She looked at him. For several seconds, neither moved. Then Silas smiled. Not fully, not brightly. Just a small, hesitant movement at the corner of his mouth. But it was real. Clara's breath caught. She had won the bet. Except she no longer cared about the money. Because she suddenly understood that the smile wasn't the victory. The victory was that Silas had allowed himself, for the first time in 7 years, to feel something other than guilt. And Clara had become part of that feeling. But neither of them knew that the worst part of the past had not yet been uncovered. Because the story Silas had told her was not the whole truth. there was one detail about the night. Anna, Caleb, and Eli died that Silas had never told anyone. And when Clara eventually discovered it, she would realize that the tragedy had not been the accident everyone in Black Pine believed it was. Someone had caused that wagon to leave the safe trail. Someone had made sure Silas arrived too late. And that person had been waiting 7 years for the mountain to forget. The smile Clara had finally seen on Silas Boone's face lasted only a few seconds. But those few seconds changed everything. Until that morning, Clara had believed Silas's story was a simple tragedy. He had lost his wife, his brother, and his young son in a winter accident. He had blamed himself. He had withdrawn from everyone. Now Clara knew there might be another explanation. Someone could have caused the accident. The thought followed Clara back to Black Pine. For several days, life returned to something almost peaceful. Clara visited Silas more often, and Silas began allowing her into the quiet parts of his life. The people of Black Pine noticed. They noticed Clara riding toward the mountain. They noticed Silas coming into town more frequently. And they noticed something else. He smiled. Not often, not broadly, but enough. The first time Amos Reed saw it, he nearly dropped his cup. Silas had been standing outside the general store when a young boy slipped on the icy road and landed in a pile of snow. Everyone laughed. Silas did too, only once, but Amos heard it. Clara saw the exchange from the store window. She smiled. For a brief time she thought the story might simply end there. Then she found the letter. It happened while Clara was helping Silas repair a damaged roof beam. She noticed a loose board beneath the eaves. Behind it was a narrow compartment. Inside was a folded piece of paper. She pulled it free. Silas saw it. His entire body went still. "Give me that." Clara handed it over. He unfolded it. His expression changed. He didn't answer. She noticed the name at the bottom. Caleb. Silas's dead brother. "He wrote this?" Silas nodded. "What does it say?" "I don't know." "Then why are you afraid of it?" Silas folded the letter. "I'm not." Clara stared at him. "You're lying." Silas looked toward the mountains. Finally he said, "I found it 7 years ago." "Before the accident?" "No." "After?" He nodded. "Then why didn't you read it?" "Because Caleb gave it to me." Clara waited. "He told me not to open it unless something happened to him." Her heart sank. "And something happened?" Silas nodded. "Then why didn't you open it?" "Because I already knew what it would say." That answer made no sense. "You watched him write it?" "Yes." "Then why hide it?" Silas looked down at the letter. "Because I was afraid of what it might prove." Clara wanted to ask more, but Silas walked away. That night she could not sleep. She kept thinking about the old trail, the collapsed bridge, the wagon, the storm, and the possibility that the accident had been caused by someone else. The next morning, she asked Amos about the bridge. He immediately became uncomfortable. "Why?" "Because I'm curious. Curiosity gets people killed in these mountains. So does ignoring things." Amos sighed. "You've been talking to Silas." "Said nothing." "He understood." "Then leave it alone." "Why?" "Because some graves are better left undisturbed." Clara stared at him. "That sounds like something people say when they're afraid of the truth." Amos looked toward the door. 7 years ago, there were rumors. "What rumors?" "That the wagon didn't simply lose control." Clara's heart began beating faster. Someone had moved the trail markers. The markers? They were supposed to guide travelers around the dangerous section near the river. And they were moved? Yes. Who moved them? We never found out. Why didn't anyone investigate? Because 3 people were dead, the bridge was gone, and the snow covered everything. And Silas? He blamed himself. Why? Amos sighed. Because he was supposed to meet them. Clara stared at him. He was supposed to meet them? Yes. What happened? He arrived late. How late? About 20 minutes. Clara went silent. 20 minutes. That detail mattered. Silas had always believed that if he had arrived sooner, he could have saved them. But if someone had moved the trail markers, then his late arrival wasn't the cause. Someone had deliberately created the disaster. Clara returned to the mountain that afternoon. Silas was outside repairing a saddle. She approached him. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Tell you what?" "That you were supposed to meet them that night." His hand stopped. "Who told you?" Silas looked toward the valley. "I didn't want you involved." "You already involved me." "You don't understand." "Then explain it." Silas was silent for a long moment. Finally he said, "Caleb knew something was wrong." "What?" "He told me someone had been following him." "Who?" "I don't know." "Did he give you a name?" "No." "Then what did he discover?" Silas walked into the cabin. He opened the old wooden chest. Beneath the child's blanket was another object, a brass key. Clara recognized it. "What does that open?" "The shed." The locked shed. For 7 years Clara had wondered what was inside. Now she understood. Silas carried the key outside. They walked together. The shed door opened with a long creak. Inside were maps, old newspapers, a rifle, a broken wagon wheel, and dozens of pieces of evidence from the night his family died. Clara looked around. "You kept all this?" "I couldn't let it go." On the wall was a large hand-drawn map of the mountain trail. Several places were marked in red. Silas pointed. "This is where the wagon should have gone." Then he pointed farther down the mountain. "This is where the markers were found." Clara studied the distance. Someone moved them nearly half a mile. Silas nodded. "That's not an accident." "No." "Then why did everyone believe it was?" "Because the man who investigated it said there was no proof." "Who?" Vale was a wealthy timber owner whose logging operation controlled much of the land north of Black Pine. He was also one of the most respected men in the region. Clara's stomach tightened. "Why would he want your brother dead?" she asked. "I don't know," Silas said. "Then what did Caleb discover?" Silas explained that Caleb had discovered illegal logging routes being cut through protected hunting grounds. Men were using hidden trails. Trees were being removed without permission. Several families had been forced off their land. Caleb had threatened to report it. Clara looked at him. "That's why someone wanted him gone?" she asked. Silas nodded. He reached into a drawer and pulled out another letter. It was addressed to Caleb. The handwriting belonged to Edmund Vale. The letter warned Caleb to stop interfering. It contained no direct threat, but the meaning was obvious. Clara read it. This could have been enough to accuse him. Not 7 years ago. Why? Because Vale had money and influence. Silas nodded. He could make people disappear from Black Pine without ever touching them. Clara looked at him. "Why didn't you expose him?" Silas lowered his eyes. "Because I had no proof. You had this. Not enough. And you gave up?" "No." Clara waited. "I spent 7 years looking." She understood. His solitude had not only been brief, it had been an investigation. Then Clara noticed a small wooden box beneath the maps. "What's that?" Silas opened it. Inside was a brass button. It carried a black pine tree, surrounded by a circle. "Where did you find this?" "Near the river." "Was it there the night of the accident?" "I found it the next morning." Clara turned it over. There was a tiny engraved letter, E. She looked at Silas. Vale, maybe, or someone else. Exactly. That uncertainty remained their greatest problem. They had suspicion, they had evidence, they had a possible motive. But they had no witness, no confession, and no undeniable proof. That evening, they returned to the cabin. The door was open. Silas had locked it before leaving. Clara froze. Silas immediately raised his rifle. They entered carefully. Nothing appeared disturbed. Then Clara saw the table. The wooden box containing the 3 names was gone. Silas stood motionless. Someone had searched his belongings. Someone knew exactly what mattered to him. Then Clara noticed something on the floor. A single black pine button, the same symbol as the one from the river. Silas picked it up. His eyes hardened. "They know," Clara whispered. "Who?" "I don't know." Outside, a horse moved through the trees. Silas grabbed the rifle. They heard the sound of hooves fading into the distance. Clara stepped beside him. "We can't stay here." Silas nodded. "No." "Where do we go?" He looked toward the old trail, the place where it happened. The river? The river. The next morning they left before sunrise. Clara had entered the mountains because she wanted to make a silent man smile. Now she was riding beside him because they both believed someone had murdered his family. And somewhere beneath 7 years of snow, mud, fallen trees, and forgotten memories, there might still be a piece of the truth waiting for them. But neither knew that Edmund Vale had already learned about Clara, and he had no intention of allowing her to leave those mountains with Silas alive. The bet had begun as a joke. The smile had become a symbol of healing. But now Clara understood the truth. She had not simply walked into Silas Boone's life. She had walked into the unfinished story of his family's death. And before winter returned, she would have to help him answer the question that had haunted him for 7 years. The next morning, Clara Bell and Silas Boone rode toward the river before sunrise. Neither spoke much. The mountains were covered in fresh snow, and the cold wind cut through their coats. Clara kept thinking about the black pine button they had found inside the cabin. Someone had entered Silas's home. Someone had stolen the box containing the names of Anna, Caleb, and Eli, and someone had followed them. They reached the old river shortly after noon. The bridge was gone. Only several broken beams remained along the riverbank, half buried beneath snow and ice. Silas dismounted. He stood silently, staring at the water. This was where his life had ended 7 years earlier. Clara did not ask what he was thinking. She simply stayed beside him. "Where did you find the button?" she asked. Silas pointed toward the opposite bank. "There." They crossed carefully over a narrow section of frozen ground. Silas began searching beneath the snow. Clara helped. After nearly an hour, she noticed something beneath a fallen pine tree, a piece of metal. She pulled it free. It was part of an old wagon latch. Silas examined it carefully. "This wasn't broken in the accident." "How do you know?" "I built that wagon." He turned it over. There were deep scratches along the metal. Someone had forced it open. Clara's eyes narrowed. Could the wagon have been damaged before they reached the bridge? Silas nodded. Maybe. They searched farther. Near the riverbank they discovered a rusted iron hook. Silas recognized it. This was used to cut rope. Why would anyone need that? Silas didn't answer. Then he noticed something carved into a tree. A small circle surrounding the shape of a pine. The same symbol appeared on the buttons. Clara touched the carving. This was made recently. Silas nodded. Someone came back. A branch snapped behind them. Silas raised his rifle. Clara froze. After several seconds, an old man stepped from the trees. Silas recognized him. Thomas. The man's face tightened. Silas Boone. Clara looked between them. Who is he? Thomas swallowed. I used to work for Edmund Vale. Silas's expression hardened. You knew. Thomas lowered his eyes. I knew something. You knew about the markers. Yes. You knew Caleb was being threatened. Thomas nodded. And you said nothing. I was afraid. Silas stepped toward him. My family died. I know. My brother died. I know. My son died. Thomas's eyes filled with tears. I know. Silas's hand tightened around the rifle. Clara stepped between them. Let him speak. Thomas took a long breath. Caleb discovered that Vale was using the mountain trails to move stolen timber. He was going to expose him. Did Vale order the accident? Thomas closed his eyes. Yes. The words seemed to freeze the air. Vale told one of his men to move the trail markers. They were supposed to make Caleb's wagon turn toward the old bridge. "Why didn't you stop him?" "I tried. Vale threatened my family." Silas lowered his rifle slightly. Thomas continued, "I thought Caleb would see the danger and turn around. But he didn't." "No. And Anna? She was with him." "Eli? He was asleep." Silas turned away. For 7 years, he had imagined that night differently. In every version, he was the one who failed. Now he finally understood. It wasn't his fault. He had not arrived too late because he was careless. Someone had deliberately created a trap. But one question remained. Why didn't Vale kill me? Thomas looked at him. He tried. Silas stared at him. "After the accident, Vale sent men to your cabin. They searched for something Caleb had hidden." "What?" Thomas shook his head. "I don't know." Silas's eyes narrowed. "The box." Thomas nodded. "Maybe." They returned to Black Pine that evening. Thomas refused to enter the settlement with them. He told them he would meet them at the old logging camp the next morning. Before leaving, he gave them one final warning. "Don't trust the sheriff." Silas looked at him. "Why?" "He's one of Vale's men." The truth became clear. The sheriff had investigated the accident. He had declared it a tragedy. He had told everyone there was no evidence of foul play. Now Clara understood why the truth had remained buried. The investigation had been controlled by the very people responsible. That night, Silas and Clara stayed inside an abandoned hunting cabin outside Black Pine. Clara sat beside the fire. Silas watched the window. "You should sleep," he said. "So should you." "I'll keep watch." "You always keep watch." "Someone has been following us." "I know." "That doesn't frighten you?" "Yes." He seemed surprised. "Then why are you staying?" Clara looked at him. "Because I'm afraid of losing you." The words surprised even her. Silas walked toward her. "You came here because of a bet." "I did." "You were supposed to make me smile." "I failed." Silas's mouth curved slightly. "No." Clara looked up. "You didn't." He reached for her hand, first time he had ever done so. "I haven't felt alive in years," he said. Clara's eyes filled with tears. "You are alive. Because of you." She shook her head. "No, you did that yourself." Silas looked at her. Then he leaned forward and kissed her. It was hesitant and gentle. A kiss between two people who had finally allowed themselves to hope again. When they separated, Clara smiled. "That counts as a smile." Silas laughed softly. "You're still keeping score?" "No." She squeezed his hand. "Not anymore." The next morning, they went to the old logging camp. Thomas was waiting, but he was not alone. 2 armed men stood behind him. Silas immediately drew his weapon. Then a voice came from the trees. "You didn't think I'd let you uncover everything, did you?" Edmund Vale stepped into view. He looked calm despite the cold. Clara recognized him immediately. Vale smiled. "Miss Bell." She stepped closer to Silas. "You followed us." "Of course." Vale looked at Silas. "You've spent 7 years digging through graves." Silas raised his rifle. "You killed them." Vale's expression remained calm. "I arranged an accident." Clara felt sick. "Why?" "Your brother was going to ruin everything. People died. 3 lives against an operation worth thousands." Silas's eyes became cold. "Caleb wasn't going to stop." "No." "And you thought killing him would make me disappear." Vale smiled. "It almost worked." Clara stepped forward, but it didn't. Vale looked at her. "You were never supposed to be involved. Yet here I am. I heard about your little bet." Clara realized the truth. Vale knew about her from the beginning. "You used me to find out what Silas knew." Silas looked at Clara. Vale continued. "Where is the box?" Silas's face hardened. Vale reached inside his coat. Then he pulled out the wooden box. Silas stared at it. "You don't understand what your brother hid." Vale opened it. Beneath the ribbon and wooden horse was a folded map. Caleb had hidden it inside the hollow base. The map showed every illegal logging route, every name, every payment, every person involved. At the bottom was the sheriff's signature. Silas looked at Clara. "This is enough." Vale smiled. "Not if you're dead." The two armed men raised their weapons. Then a rifle shot cracked through the trees. One man dropped his gun. Thomas had fired. The camp erupted into chaos. Silas pulled Clara behind a fallen log. Shots echoed through the trees. Snow burst from the branches. Vale ran toward the horses. Silas pursued him. Moments later, Vale fell wounded in the snow. Silas stood over him with the rifle. Vale looked up. "You've waited 7 years for this." Silas's finger rested near the trigger. "Do it." Vale smiled. "Become the monster everyone already thinks you are." Silas stared at him. For 7 years, revenge had been the one thing keeping him alive. Now he had the chance. Clara approached slowly. "You don't have to carry another death." Silas looked at her. Then he lowered the rifle. "No." Vale stared at him. "The law can decide what happens to you." Thomas stepped forward. "Not anymore." Behind him came several men from Black Pine, including Amos Reed. The sheriff was arrested later that afternoon. The evidence in Caleb's map exposed the illegal logging operation and everyone involved. The truth about the accident finally became known. For the first time in 7 years, Silas no longer had to believe that he was responsible. He had arrived too late, but he had never been the reason they died. That distinction changed him. Winter passed. Clara remained at Silas's cabin. At first, she told herself she would leave when spring came, but neither of them believed that anymore. Silas repaired the second chair. Clara watched him. "Why are you fixing that?" she asked. He smiled. "Because someone lives here now." She laughed. "And the second cup?" "Already in use." "And the shed?" Silas looked toward it. "I think it's time to open the windows." For the first time in 7 years, he opened the shed. They carried out the old belongings together. Some things they kept, some things they buried. The wooden horse was placed above the fireplace. Anna's ribbon was folded beside it. Caleb's letter was framed. Silas did not erase their memories. He simply stopped hiding them. One warm spring morning, Clara sat beside him outside the cabin. "Do you remember the bet?" Silas smiled. "I remember. You know I never collected the $10. You should have." "Why?" "You won." Clara shook her head. "I didn't make you smile." Silas looked at her. "You made me want to." Clara leaned against his shoulder. "And what happened to the man who never smiled?" Silas looked toward the mountains. He finally stopped punishing himself. Clara smiled. Then Silas kissed her forehead. The mountains remained the same. The river still ran beneath the old bridge. The cabin still stood among the pines. But Silas Boone was no longer the man who had lived there 7 years earlier. He had learned that remembering the dead did not require destroying the living. And Clara had learned something too. Sometimes a person doesn't need someone to make them happy. They simply need someone willing to stay long enough for them to remember that happiness is still possible. The bet that brought Clara into the mountains had begun as a foolish challenge. She was supposed to make a silent mountain man smile. Instead, she helped him uncover the truth about the people he had lost. She helped him put down a burden he had carried for 7 years. And somewhere between the snow, the danger, the laughter, and the quiet nights beside the fire, she became the woman he could no longer imagine living without. Years later, the people of Black Pine would still tell the story. They would say Clara Bell came into the mountains believing she could win $10 by making Silas Boone smile. But the truth was better. She never won the bet. She won his trust. She won his heart. And Silas Boone finally discovered that the greatest act of courage was not surviving alone. It was allowing himself to love again.